Samuel Harrison had been walking along the Clearwater River for 3 months now, ever since Martha passed away. The morning ritual had become his only companion in a world that felt too quiet, too empty, without her gentle laughter filling their small cabin. At 62, Samuel found solace in the rhythmic sound of water flowing over smooth stones, a meditation that helped him process the grief that sat heavy in his chest like an undigested meal. The autumn morning was crisp, with golden leaves dancing down from the cottonwoods that lined the riverbank. Samuel pulled his worn leather jacket tighter around his shoulders as he made his way down the familiar path. His boots crunched softly on fallen leaves, and his breath formed small clouds in the cool air. This walk had become sacred to him, a time when he could talk to Martha as if she were still there beside him, sharing observations about the changing seasons and the wildlife they had both loved to watch. As he rounded the bend where the river curved toward the old wooden bridge, something unusual caught his eye. There, partially submerged in the shallow water near the bank, was what appeared to be a wooden box. Samuel stopped abruptly, his heart quickening. The object was definitely man-made, weathered and darkened by water, but clearly crafted with care. It looked almost like a small chest or container, trapped among the rocks where the current had deposited it. Samuel carefully made his way down the muddy bank, his weathered hands gripping small branches for balance. As he got closer, his breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just any wooden box. The craftsmanship was unmistakable, with dovetail joints and carved details that spoke of old-world skill. But more disturbing was its size and shape. It looked remarkably like a small coffin, perhaps made for a child or infant. His hands trembled slightly as he waded into the cold water, the shock of it seeping through his boots. The box was heavier than he expected, waterlogged and solid. As he lifted it from the river, water poured from its edges. He could see that it had been sealed, though time and the elements had begun to work on the joints. The wood was a rich walnut, darkened now but still showing traces of the beautiful grain beneath. Samuel's mind raced with possibilities, none of them pleasant. Who would make such a thing? How long had it been in the river? The questions multiplied. As he struggled to carry the heavy box up the bank to dry ground, his heart pounded not just from the physical exertion, but from a growing sense of dread, mixed with curiosity that he couldn't shake. Setting the coffin down on a flat area covered with dry leaves, Samuel took a step back and really looked at what he had found. The lid was held down with old-fashioned brass hinges and what appeared to be a simple latch mechanism. Intricate carvings decorated the sides, though they were worn smooth in places by the water's constant caress. There were symbols that looked almost like letters or perhaps decorative flourishes, but the water damage made them difficult to decipher. Samuel had lived in this valley his entire life, had known every family, every story, every tragedy that had touched their small community, but he couldn't recall anyone mentioning a lost child's coffin, couldn't imagine how such a thing might end up in the river. The thought of what might be inside made his stomach churn, but something deeper, some instinct he couldn't name, told him this discovery was important. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows through the trees and warming Samuel's back as he knelt beside the mysterious box. He thought of Martha, of how she would have approached this situation. She had always been the brave one, the one who faced difficult truths head-on while he tended to avoid unpleasant realities. "What would you do, my dear?" he whispered to the morning air, half expecting to hear her practical voice in response. A red-winged blackbird landed on a nearby branch, cocking its head at Samuel as if studying the unusual scene. The bird's presence somehow comforted him, reminding him that life continued its cycles regardless of human mysteries and sorrows. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the small multi-tool Martha had given him for his last birthday, saying he needed to be prepared for anything. On his walks, Samuel's fingers traced the edge of the latch, feeling the cold metal against his skin. Whatever was inside this coffin had been placed there with intention, sealed away from the world for reasons he could only imagine. Part of him wanted to carry it back to town, let Sheriff Morrison deal with whatever secrets it held. But another part of him, the part that had been walking these riverbanks searching for meaning in his grief, knew that this discovery was somehow meant for him. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves overhead and carrying the scent of wood smoke. From distant cabins, Samuel could hear the faint sound of a train whistle in the distance, a reminder of the world beyond this quiet place where he had stumbled upon something that would change everything. His hands moved to the latch, and he took a deep breath, knowing that once he opened this box, there would be no going back to the simple grief that had defined his mornings. As his fingers worked at the old mechanism, Samuel felt a strange mixture of fear and anticipation building in his chest. The latch was stuck, corroded by time and water, but he could feel it beginning to give way under his persistent efforts. Whatever lay inside this small coffin had been waiting for someone to find it, and fate had chosen him to be that person on this crisp autumn morning by the Clearwater River. The latch finally gave way with a soft click that seemed to echo through the quiet morning. Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs as he slowly lifted the lid, prepared for the worst, but hoping for something less terrible than his imagination had conjured. The hinges creaked softly, protesting after their long submersion, and then the contents of the small coffin lay revealed in the dappled sunlight filtering through the cottonwood leaves. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. Not from horror. Instead of the grim discovery he had anticipated, he found himself looking at something beautiful and mysterious. Nestled inside the waterproof interior was a collection of items that told a story of love and loss, but not the tragic tale of a child's death that he had feared. The coffin had been lined with oiled leather that had protected its contents from the river's intrusion, creating a time capsule of memories. The first item that caught his attention was a bundle of letters. Tied with a faded blue ribbon, the same shade that Martha had favored for her hair ribbons when they were courting, the letters were dry and well-preserved, written in an elegant hand on paper that had yellowed with age. Beneath the letters lay a small leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by countless hands. Next to the journal was a delicate silver locket, tarnished but intact, and a small wooden toy horse, carved with the same skilled craftsmanship that had created the coffin itself. Samuel's hands shook as he reached for the bundle of letters, noting how carefully they had been placed. With obvious love and attention to their preservation, the top letter bore an address written in that same flowing script, and as he read the name, his world tilted on its axis. The letter was addressed to my dearest Margaret Harrison, and suddenly Samuel understood that this wasn't a stranger's coffin he had found, something connected to his own family history. Margaret Harrison had been his grandmother, a woman he had barely known but who had left an indelible mark on family stories. She had died when Samuel was just a boy, but the tales of her beauty, her kindness, and her mysterious past had been passed down through generations. His father had often spoken of her with a mixture of love and sadness, hinting at secrets that were never fully explained. Now, it seemed, some of those secrets were literally floating to the surface. With trembling fingers, Samuel untied the ribbon and carefully unfolded the first letter. The paper was fragile but readable, and as his eyes moved across the lines, he began to understand the magnitude of his discovery. The letter was a love letter, passionate and desperate, written by someone signing himself only as your devoted Thomas. The date at the top indicated it had been written in 1884, more than 40 years ago. When his grandmother would have been a young woman, the letter spoke of forbidden love, of meetings by moonlight, and of a future that seemed impossible but desperately desired. Thomas wrote of his plans to take Margaret away from the valley, to start a new life where their love could flourish without the constraints of society's expectations. He promised her a wedding, a home, and all the happiness that had been denied them by circumstances Samuel was beginning to piece together. From the passionate words on the yellowed pages, Samuel set the first letter aside and reached for the journal, his mind reeling with the implications of what he was discovering. As he opened the leather cover, he recognized his grandmother's handwriting, the same script he remembered from birthday cards and Christmas notes from his childhood. The first entry was dated just days after the letter he had just read, and Margaret's words painted a picture of a young woman torn between duty and desire. She wrote about Thomas with a love so pure and intense that Samuel felt like an intruder reading her private thoughts. Thomas, it became clear, was not his grandfather. Samuel's grandfather, Robert Harrison, had been a practical man chosen by Margaret's family for his stability and prospects, not for love. But Thomas had been her heart's true choice, a wandering carpenter who had come to the valley to work on the new church and had instead found something more precious than any building he could construct. The journal entries revealed a secret courtship conducted in defiance of family wishes and social expectations. Margaret and Thomas had met in hidden places, shared dreams of escape, and planned a future that seemed as fragile as the butterfly wings she pressed between the pages of her diary. Samuel found several of these pressed flowers still intact, their colors faded but their delicate forms preserved like the love story they represented. As Samuel continued reading, the tragedy of his grandmother's situation became clear. Her family had discovered the romance and forbidden her from seeing Thomas again. They had accelerated her engagement to Robert Harrison, scheduling a wedding that would take place within the month. Margaret's entries became increasingly desperate, as she faced the choice between duty to her family and loyalty to her heart. The final entry in the journal was the most heartbreaking. Margaret wrote about her last meeting with Thomas, about their mutual decision that she could not abandon her family's expectations, and about the promise they made to each other that their love would survive, even if their lives took separate paths. She described how Thomas had crafted this small coffin as a repository for their love, a place where their letters and memories could be preserved even if their future together could not. Samuel lifted the silver locket, with shaking hands and managed to open the delicate clasp. Inside were two small photographs, one of his grandmother as a young woman, radiant and beautiful, and another of a handsome man with kind eyes and carpenter's hands. This, then, was Thomas, the man who had loved his grandmother with such intensity that he had created this waterproof treasure chest to preserve their love for eternity. The final item in the coffin was the wooden toy horse, carved with exquisite detail and painted in colors that had somehow survived the decades. A small note was tied around the horse's neck with thread, and when Samuel unfolded it, he read Thomas's final message to Margaret: "For the children we will never have, but who live in my heart alongside you. May this token find its way to them someday, so they might know that true love existed here." Samuel sat beside the open coffin for what felt like hours, though the sun had barely moved across the sky. The weight of his discovery pressed down on him like a physical force, reshaping everything he thought he knew about his family, his grandmother, and the very foundations of his existence. The toy horse sat in his palm, smooth and warm now from his touch. As he tried to process the implications of Thomas's final note, the phrase "the children we will never have" echoed in Samuel's mind as he began to understand the true tragedy of his grandmother's story. Margaret had married Robert Harrison out of duty, not love, and had lived her entire life carrying the secret of her true feelings. Samuel's father had been born of that dutiful marriage, and Samuel himself was the grandchild Thomas had imagined in his note. The descendant who would someday learn about the love that had been sacrificed for family honor and social expectations. As Samuel read through more of the letters, a fuller picture emerged of Thomas's character and the depth of their relationship. Thomas had not been some drifter or fortune hunter, as Samuel had initially suspected. Instead, he revealed himself through his words to be a man of integrity and skill, someone who understood the impossible position Margaret faced, and who loved her enough to step aside rather than force her to choose between him and her family. Letters spoke of shared dreams and philosophical discussions, of long walks along this very river where Samuel now sat, and of quiet moments when they had imagined a different world where love could triumph over social convention. Thomas wrote about his work on the church, how he carved small hearts into the woodwork where only Margaret would know to look for them, creating a secret language of love that would outlast their time together. Samuel realized with a start that he knew that church well. It still stood in the center of town, its wooden interior a testament to Thomas's craftsmanship. How many times had Samuel sat in those pews, unknowingly surrounded by hidden symbols of a love story he never knew existed? The thought sent shivers down his spine and made him look at the familiar landscape around him with new eyes. The journal entries revealed Margaret's internal struggle in painful detail. She wrote about sleepless nights, about the pressure from her parents, who spoke of family duty, and financial security, and about her growing understanding that loving Thomas would mean destroying the expectations and hopes of everyone around her. She described Robert Harrison as a kind but distant man, someone she could respect but never truly love, and her heart-wrenching acceptance that companionship would have to substitute for passion. One entry particularly moved Samuel to tears. Margaret had written about a conversation with her mother, who had confided that she too had married for practical reasons rather than love, and that this was simply the way of the world for women of their station. Margaret's mother had urged her to find contentment in duty and motherhood, to push aside foolish romantic notions in favor of stability and respectability. The weight of generational expectation pressed down on Margaret's words, making her eventual decision feel inevitable rather than chosen. Samuel found himself thinking about his own marriage to Martha, and how different his experience had been. From his grandmothers, he and Martha had married for love, had chosen each other freely, and built a life based on mutual affection and shared dreams. The freedom to make that choice, he realized now, had been bought with his grandmother's sacrifice. Her acceptance of duty had preserved the family's reputation and financial stability, creating the foundation that allowed future generations to marry for love rather than obligation. The later letters from Thomas revealed his own struggle with their decision. He wrote about his attempts to forget Margaret, his travels to distant towns in search of work and peace, and his eventual understanding that some loves are too deep to be forgotten, but too precious to be selfish about. His final letters spoke of his decision to create the Coffin as a way of honoring their love while accepting its end, a gesture both romantic and practical that would preserve their story for posterity. Thomas had clearly spent considerable time planning the coffin's construction and contents. He wrote about selecting the perfect piece of walnut wood, about crafting the waterproof seal that would protect their memories from the elements, and about his choice to place it in the river, where it might someday be found by someone who could appreciate its significance. He had even included detailed instructions about the location, describing landmarks and seasonal changes that would help identify the spot where he planned to commit their love story to the water's care. Reading these instructions, Samuel realized that Thomas had intended for the coffin to be found eventually, but not immediately. He had calculated the river's flow patterns, had considered seasonal flooding and drought cycles, had chosen a location where the box would be protected but discoverable. The fact that Samuel had found it now, more than 40 years later, seemed less like coincidence and more like the fulfillment of Thomas's careful plan. Samuel also discovered that Thomas had not been a stranger to the valley after Margaret's wedding. Several letters indicated that he had returned periodically over the years, always from a distance, to ensure that Margaret was well and happy. He had watched Samuel's father grow up, had observed the family's prosperity, and had taken quiet satisfaction in knowing that his sacrifice had contributed to their well-being. This revelation added another layer of complexity to Samuel's understanding of the situation. The final revelation came in Thomas's last letter, written nearly 20 years after their initial parting. Thomas revealed that he had never married, had never found another love to replace what he had shared with Margaret, and had lived his life as a testament to their connection. He wrote about his decision to place the coffin in the river as his final act of devotion, trusting that someday their story would emerge and be understood by someone who could appreciate the depth of their sacrifice. Samuel carefully returned the precious items to the coffin and carried his discovery home, his mind spinning with questions that demanded answers. His small cabin, which had felt so empty since Martha's passing, now seemed to pulse with the presence of family secrets waiting to be fully understood. Placed the coffin on Martha's old sewing table, where the afternoon light would illuminate its contents as he continued his investigation. The first place Samuel looked for answers was in his father's old trunk, stored in the bedroom closet since his death 5 years earlier. Samuel had avoided going through these possessions, finding the task too painful in the immediate aftermath of his loss. Now, however, he approached the trunk with purpose, hoping to find some reference to Thomas, or some indication that his father had known about his mother's secret love. Among his father's papers, Samuel found several items that suddenly took on new significance. There was a small wooden cross, carved in the same distinctive style as the toy horse from the coffin. There were also several sketches of woodworking designs, drawn in a hand that was not his father's, and a collection of pressed flowers similar to those he had found in Margaret's journal. Most intriguingly, there was a letter in his father's handwriting, addressed to the unknown craftsman, but never sent. Samuel's hands trembled as he opened this unsent letter, dated just months before his father's death. In it, his father revealed that he had always suspected his mother harbored feelings for someone other than his father. He wrote about subtle signs he had noticed throughout his childhood, his mother's distant expression during certain seasons, her habit of walking alone by the river, and her collection of small wooden objects that she treasured, never explained. The letter revealed that Samuel's father had discovered some of Thomas's work in the church and had recognized the same craftsmanship in objects around their home. He had pieced together enough of the story to understand that his mother had sacrificed a great love for the sake of family duty, and he had spent his adult life trying to honor that sacrifice by being the best son and husband he could be. The letter was his attempt to reach out to Thomas, to let him know that his sacrifice had not gone unnoticed or unappreciated. Samuel realized that his father had been searching for Thomas, just as the coffin had been searching for someone to discover it. The timing of everything began to feel less like coincidence and more like destiny. His father had died without ever sending the letter or finding Thomas, but Samuel's discovery of the coffin felt like the completion of his father's unfinished mission. Armed with this new information, Samuel decided to visit Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, the oldest resident of their small town and the unofficial keeper of local history. If anyone would remember Thomas, or know what had become of him, it would be Eleanor. Her small house near the town square was filled with photographs, newspaper clippings, and memorabilia from decades of valley life. Eleanor, now in her 80s but still sharp as a tack, welcomed Samuel with surprise and curiosity. When he carefully explained his discovery and showed her some of the letters, her eyes filled with tears and she nodded knowingly. She had been a young woman when Thomas worked on the church, and she remembered him well. More importantly, she had suspected the romance between Thomas and Margaret, though she had never spoken of it out of respect for the families involved. Eleanor revealed that Thomas had indeed returned to the valley several times over the years, always discreetly and always alone. She had seen him at Margaret's funeral 15 years earlier, standing at the back of the church during the service, his head bowed and his hat in his hands. He had approached her afterward and asked about Margaret's family, about whether she had been happy and whether her children had thrived. When Eleanor assured him that Margaret had lived a good life and raised wonderful children, Thomas had smiled sadly and disappeared back into the crowd. Most remarkably, Eleanor told Samuel that Thomas was still alive, living in a small cabin. About 50 miles upstream, near the headwaters of the Clearwater River, he was now an elderly man, she said, but still working as a carpenter and caretaker for a mountain lodge. Eleanor had heard reports of him over the years from travelers and supply deliveries, and she knew that he had never married or settled down permanently anywhere. This revelation hit Samuel like a physical blow. The man who had loved his grandmother was still alive, still carrying the weight of their shared secret after all these years. Samuel felt an overwhelming urge to meet Thomas, to return the coffin to him, to let him know that his love story had finally been discovered and understood. But he also felt the weight of responsibility that came with such knowledge. Eleanor seemed to read his thoughts and placed a gentle hand on his arm. She reminded Samuel that Thomas had chosen to let Margaret go all those years ago, and that interfering now might cause more pain than comfort. However, she also acknowledged that the discovery of the coffin might be exactly the closure that both Samuel and Thomas needed. She suggested that Samuel take time to consider his options. Carefully before making any decisions about contact, Samuel spent the evening rereading the letters and journal entries, trying to imagine what Thomas might be feeling after all these years. Had he given up hope that the coffin would ever be found? Did he still think about Margaret and wonder about her family? Samuel found himself particularly moved by Thomas's earlier letters, which revealed a man of deep sensitivity and thoughtfulness. Someone who would have been a wonderful addition to their family if circumstances had been different. As night fell, Samuel made his decision. He would seek out Thomas not to disrupt his life or to cause him pain, but to return the coffin and to let him know that his love story had touched another generation. Samuel felt that his grandmother, his father, and even Martha wanted him to complete this circle, to bridge the gap between past and present that the coffin had created when it emerged from the river the next morning. Samuel prepared for his journey upstream, packing the coffin carefully and including a letter of his own introduction. He explained his relationship to Margaret, described his discovery of the coffin, expressed his desire to meet the man who had loved his grandmother with such devotion. He promised that his intentions were peaceful and respectful, and that he simply wanted to honor the love story that had shaped his family's history in ways he was only now beginning to understand. The journey upstream took Samuel most of the day, following old logging roads and game trails that wound through increasingly wild country. As he traveled higher into the mountains, the Clearwater River transformed from the gentle, meandering waterway he knew into a rushing mountain stream fed by snowmelt and spring water. The country grew more rugged and beautiful. With towering pines and granite peaks that seemed to touch the sky, Samuel had borrowed a horse and cart from his neighbor. For the journey, knowing that the coffin and his supplies would be too much to carry on foot, the rhythmic sound of the horse's hooves on the mountain path gave him time to think about what he would say when he finally met Thomas. How do you approach someone who has carried a secret love for 40 years? How do you explain that there? Most private feelings have been discovered by a stranger who happens to share blood with their lost love. As the afternoon shadows grew longer, Samuel began to worry that he might not find the cabin before dark. The directions Eleanor had given him were based on old landmarks and travelers' tales, and the mountain country all began to look similar. As the miles passed, just as he was considering making camp for the night, he spotted smoke rising from a chimney in a small clearing ahead. The cabin was smaller than Samuel had expected, but beautifully crafted with the same attention to detail he had observed in Thomas's other work. The logs were perfectly fitted, the chinking was neat and weatherproof, and the entire structure had the solid, permanent look of something built by a master craftsman. A small garden grew beside the cabin, and several pieces of finished woodwork sat on the covered porch, waiting for delivery or pickup. Samuel's heart pounded as he approached the cabin, unsure of how to announce himself or explain his presence. Before he could decide on the best approach, the cabin door opened and an elderly man stepped onto the porch. Even 40 years older and weathered by mountain living, Samuel recognized him immediately from the photograph in Margaret's locket. This was Thomas, and the intelligence and kindness in his eyes remained unchanged despite the passage of time. Thomas studied Samuel for a long moment, his experienced eyes taking in the cart, the carefully wrapped bundle that could only be the coffin, and Samuel's nervous but determined expression. When Thomas spoke, his voice was deep and gentle, with the measured cadence of someone accustomed to solitude but not unfriendly to company. "You must be Margaret's grandson," Thomas said simply, as if he had been expecting this visit for years. "You have her eyes and your father's jaw. I've been wondering when someone would find it." The simple acknowledgement broke down all of Samuel's carefully planned speeches and explanations. Instead, he found himself struggling with unexpected emotion as he nodded and climbed down from the cart. Thomas approached slowly, his movements careful but steady, and helped Samuel unwrap the coffin from its protective coverings. When the walnut wood caught the afternoon sunlight, Thomas's composure finally cracked. He placed both hands on the lid of the coffin he had crafted so many years ago, and tears ran down his weathered cheeks as he traced the carvings with fingers that remembered every cut and curve. For several minutes, neither man spoke, united in their understanding of what this moment meant. Thomas invited Samuel into the cabin, where they carefully placed the coffin on a handmade table that perfectly complemented its craftsmanship. The interior of the cabin was sparse but comfortable, with furniture that showed the same attention to detail as everything else Thomas created. Photographs lined one wall, and Samuel was surprised to see several images of his family among them, including pictures of his own wedding to Martha and his father's funeral. Seeing Samuel's surprised expression, Thomas explained that he had maintained distant contact with several people in the valley over the years, never intruding but always caring about Margaret's family. He had received news of births, deaths, marriages, and other major events, allowing him to feel connected to the life Margaret had chosen without disrupting it. Thomas made coffee, and they sat together as Samuel shared the story of finding the coffin, reading the letters, and learning about his grandmother's secret love. Thomas listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or smiling at memories that Samuel's words brought back. When Samuel finished his account, Thomas was quiet for a long time, staring out the cabin window toward the distant peaks. Finally, Thomas spoke about his decision to create the coffin and release it into the river. He explained that he had reached a point in his life where carrying the secret alone had become too difficult, but he had not wanted to burden Margaret or her family with his feelings. The coffin had been his way of preserving their love while releasing his hold on it, trusting that fate would decide if and when their story should be revealed. Thomas admitted that he had often wondered what became of the coffin, whether it had been destroyed by the elements or discovered by strangers who would not understand its significance. Learning that it had found its way to Margaret's grandson felt like a kind of miracle, a sign that their love had served its purpose by bringing them together across the generations. As evening approached, Thomas shared stories about Margaret that Samuel had never heard, painting a picture of a young woman who was even more remarkable than family legends had suggested. Spoke about her intelligence, her compassion, and her strength in making the difficult choice to honor her family's expectations, despite her personal feelings. Thomas made it clear that he had never regretted their decision to part, because he had seen how it allowed Margaret to build a good life and raise wonderful children. Samuel found himself sharing memories of Martha, describing how their love had been built on the foundation of freedom to choose that his grandmother's sacrifice had helped provide. Thomas listened with genuine interest and warmth, asking questions about Martha's interests and personality, and expressing sorrow for Samuel's recent loss. As the conversation continued deep into the evening, both men began to understand that this meeting was providing something both of them needed. For Thomas, it was the opportunity to connect with Margaret's legacy and to see that his love had contributed to something larger than their individual happiness. For Samuel, it was the chance to understand his family's history more completely and to find meaning in his grief. Through connection to an even greater love story, Samuel stayed with Thomas for 3 days, and in that time both men discovered a connection that transcended their shared link to Margaret. Thomas, who had lived alone for so many years, found unexpected comfort in Samuel's company, while Samuel discovered in Thomas the grandfather figure he had never truly had. Their conversations ranged from practical matters of mountain living and woodworking to deeper discussions about love, loss, and the choices that define a life. On the second morning, Thomas took Samuel to a special place high above the cabin, where a natural outcropping provided a breathtaking view of the entire valley below. Here, Thomas explained, he had come often over the years to feel connected to Margaret and the life she had built with his blessing. He could see the distant spire of the church he had helped build, the winding path of the Clearwater River, and the general area where Margaret had lived and raised her family. Thomas revealed that this viewpoint had been his way of staying connected. Without intruding, his method of watching over Margaret's happiness from afar, he had witnessed the changing seasons of her life through this distant perspective, celebrating her joys and mourning her sorrows as best he could from his self-imposed exile. The revelation moved Samuel deeply, adding another layer to his understanding of Thomas's character and devotion. During their time together, Thomas also showed Samuel his workshop, where decades of beautiful craftsmanship filled every corner. There were pieces destined for the mountain lodge where Thomas worked, personal projects that pleased his artistic sensibilities, and several items that he revealed were meant for Margaret's family. Thomas had carved a cradle when Samuel's father was born, a jewelry box for Samuel's sister, and even a small chest for Samuel's own wedding, though none of these gifts had ever been delivered. The sight of these undelivered gifts, crafted with love but never shared, brought both men to tears. Thomas explained that he had made them as a way of participating in the family's milestones, of expressing his care even when he could not be present. Each piece represented a moment when he had wanted to reach out, but had honored his commitment to stay away. making his love manifest in wood and craftsmanship instead of personal contact. Samuel insisted that Thomas keep the coffin, arguing that it belonged to the man who had created it and filled it with such devotion. But Thomas gently disagreed, explaining that the coffin had served its purpose by bringing them together, and that it now belonged to Margaret's family as part of their history. However, he asked Samuel to accept the undelivered gifts as a way of completing the connections he had always wanted to make. On the final evening of Samuel's visit, Thomas made an unexpected proposal. He suggested that Samuel return periodically to visit, not as a duty or obligation, but as a friendship between two men who understood something important about love and sacrifice. Thomas explained that their meeting had given him something he had not realized he was missing, a sense of family connection that made his solitary life feel less isolated. Thomas also asked Samuel to carry a message back to the valley, not a disruption of anyone's peace, but a simple acknowledgement that could be shared or kept private as Samuel saw fit. The message was for Margaret's grave, a final declaration of love that Thomas had carried for 40 years but had never been able to express. He asked Samuel to place some wildflowers from the mountain meadows on Margaret's headstone as a token, from someone who had never stopped loving her. As Samuel prepared to leave, Thomas presented him with a final gift, a beautifully carved walking stick that would serve as both a practical aid and a reminder of their connection. The stick was engraved with symbols that told the story of their meeting, the discovery of the coffin, and the bridge that had been built between past and present. Thomas explained that he wanted Samuel to carry something that would remind him that love, once true, never really ends, but transforms into something that can bless future generations. The journey back down the mountain gave Samuel time to process everything that had happened and to plan how he would honor the trust Thomas had placed in him. The walking stick felt solid and reassuring in his hand, and the wagon now carried not just the coffin, but also the undelivered gifts that represented decades of unexpressed love and care. When Samuel reached the valley, his first stop was the cemetery where Margaret lay buried beside her husband Robert. The headstone was simple granite, weathered by years but still clearly readable. Samuel placed the mountain wildflowers Thomas had requested, their bright colors a stark contrast to the gray stone. As he stood there, Samuel spoke quietly to his grandmother, telling her about Thomas, about the coffin, about the love that had survived 40 years of separation. Samuel felt a profound sense of completion as he shared Thomas's final message. With Margaret's memory, he realized that the love story he had discovered was not a tragedy, as he had initially believed, but rather a different kind of triumph. Thomas and Margaret had loved each other deeply enough to sacrifice their own happiness for the greater good of family and community, and that sacrifice had borne fruit in the lives and freedoms of future generations. Over the following weeks, Samuel found himself changed by his experience. The crushing grief that had defined his mornings since Martha's death was still present, but it was now accompanied by a deeper understanding of love's many forms and expressions. He began to see that his own love for Martha was part of a continuum. That included Thomas and Margaret, his parents, and countless other couples who had loved, lost throughout history. Samuel also discovered that carrying Thomas and Margaret's secret had given him a new sense of purpose. He began visiting Thomas regularly, making the mountain journey once a month to share news from the valley and to enjoy the friendship that had developed between them. These visits became precious to both men, providing Thomas with connection to the world below and giving Samuel wisdom and perspective that helped him navigate his own grief. The small community began to notice changes in Samuel. Where he had been withdrawn and isolated since Martha's death, he now seemed more engaged with life, more interested in the stories and struggles of his neighbors. He began sharing some of Thomas's woodworking techniques with younger men in the valley, passing on skills and knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. He never revealed the full story of his discovery, but he found ways to honor the legacy of love and craftsmanship that Thomas represented. Samuel also made peace with his own memories of Martha, understanding now that love does not end with death, but transforms into something that can guide and inspire the living. The walking stick Thomas had made became his constant companion on his morning walks by the river, and he often found himself talking to both Martha and his grandmother as he walked, feeling their presence in the rhythm of the water and the whisper of the wind through the trees. As the seasons changed and Samuel adapted to his new understanding of love and loss, he began to see the discovery of the coffin as the beginning rather than the end of his story. The love between Thomas and Margaret had waited 40 years to find expression through their family, and Samuel realized that his own love for Martha might have similar power to influence and bless future generations in ways he could not yet imagine. The coffin now sat in a place of honor in Samuel's cabin, not as a morbid curiosity, but as a testament to the enduring power of true love. Sometimes when the light was just right, Samuel would open it and read one of the letters, always finding new meaning in the words, and always grateful for the chance to be part of a love story that had transcended time, death, and the barriers that society had tried to impose. Samuel understood. Now that his morning walks by the river had prepared him for this discovery, that his grief for Martha had opened his heart to recognize and appreciate the deeper grief and love that Thomas had carried for so many years, the river that had brought him the coffin continued to flow past his door, carrying new stories and possibilities downstream, reminding him daily that love, like water, finds a way to continue its journey regardless of the obstacles it encounters. In his final years, Samuel became the keeper of not just Thomas and Margaret's story, but of the larger truth about love that their sacrifice had revealed. He learned that the greatest loves are often marked not by what they achieve for themselves, but by what they make possible for others, and that the true measure of devotion is not possession, but the willingness to let go when letting go serves the greater good.